Hello, Bio 100. This is going to be our lecture over Chapter 19, which covers animals. We begin with section 19.1, in which we first define animals. Animals are multicellular eukaryotes. So in other words, they have a nucleus and they consist of more than one cell. There are no single-celled animals. A single-celled organism that resembles an animal would be a protist in the kingdom Protista. So animals are also chemoheterotrophs, meaning they do not make their own food, but they consume preformed food. So they're not autotrophic like plants. And they're similar to fungi, except animals ingest food and digest it internally, whereas fungi grows on the food that it's going to eat and secretes enzymes and digests the food externally. Animals typically, but not always, carry out sexual reproduction. And so they begin life as a fertilized diploid egg, known as a zygote, and then they undergo these developmental changes, as we see depicted in these pictures from our text, in the development of a tadpole. And they eventually develop into an organism that has specialized tissues. And so, of course, examples of tissues would include muscle tissue, nerve tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. Tissues are defined as a group of cells that work together to perform a common function. If we look at the evolutionary tree of animals, we see that we began on the left-hand side of this phylogenetic tree, in other words, an evolutionary family history tree, with the simplest of animals, which are the sponges. As we make our way towards the right-hand side of our diagram, then we have the cnidarians, which include the jellyfish, the flatworms, which include the planarians, the mollusks, which include snails and mussels, annelids, which include the segmented worms, nematodes, which include the roundworms. The largest group of animals, arthropods, which include insects, as well as crustaceans and a few other groups, including arachnids. And then we have the echinoderms, which include starfish, and then the chordates, which have backbones. So it's important to remember that although when we think of animals, we probably think of animals that have backbones, animals that have backbones, known as vertebrates, are actually one of the smaller groups of animals on the face of the earth today. There are 35 different phyla of organisms, of course a taxonomic category, and the majority of these are invertebrates. The relationships between all these organisms today are determined via the sequences of nucleic acids. Primarily DNA, but sometimes RNA would be used as well. We begin with sponges and cnidarians. Sponges, in fact, first of all. And so sponges, depicted in this diagram on our screen, are very simple organisms. In fact, they're just barely animals. They only have the cellular level of organization. They don't have any tissues. So they're essentially a collection of cells that work together to promote the survival of the organism. And if we look at the cells, we see that there are a couple different types of cells that are present in a sponge. There are these cells referred to as collar cells that I'm pointing to with the pointer on the screen at this time. These are collar cells. They have little flagella that beat, creating a flow of water. They strain bacteria and phytoplankton from the water and digest that. There are amoeboid cells that are present in the sponge, and there are also epidermal cells. There are also these structures referred to as spicules that are made of silica, a type of glass that make it very difficult to eat a sponge. Sponges are mostly marine organisms, although we do have a few freshwater sponges found here in Kentucky. And sponges are filter feeders, as we mentioned here, filtering bacteria, phytoplankton from the water and consuming those single-celled organisms. We next go to phylum Cnidaria, the cnidarians. And so cnidarians are interesting for a couple of reasons. One is they have true tissues, unlike the sponges. So here's our first group of organisms in which we have true tissues. They are also radially symmetrical. And so radial symmetry would be demonstrated by a cheese pizza. Imagine that you have a pizza that has no toppings, it's homogeneous, all the way across all the way across the pizza. You could cut it in half in any angle and end up with two distinctly identical halves. And so this is radial symmetry. Most organisms possess bilateral symmetry. Humans would be an example of that. And so they can only be You can only draw a line down them in one direction that splits them into two exact halves, but cnidarians are radially symmetrical. Cnidarians include things like the sea anemone, jellyfish, the nearly microscopic hydra found in fresh water, and all cnidarians possess nematocysts. Nematocysts are small, stinging cells that these organisms use both to defend themselves and to obtain food. And so you're familiar with jellyfish and how jellyfish can sting. That's a result of these nematocysts that they possess. There are two life forms possessed by cnidarians, a polyp and a medusa. So the medusa is the free-swimming form. A jellyfish would be an example of a medusa. The polyp is an anchored form. And so the sea anemone is a good example of the polyp. And these organisms go back and forth between these two stages in a single species within their life cycle. We make our way now to arthropods. So arthropods are the most abundant invertebrates found on the face of the earth. And if you think about an arthropod, then remember these characteristics. Arthropods have a segmented body with a hard exoskeleton and jointed appendages, kind of like they're wearing a suit of armor. And so unlike, of course, mammals and reptiles and birds and amphibians, they don't have an internal skeleton, but their skeleton is entirely on the outside of their body. So this makes it more difficult to move. If we look at the centipede that's found on the screen, we see that it can move at these joints, but it provides some protection, at least from moderate-sized organisms, as a result of that exoskeleton. So the exoskeleton protects the organisms from predators, it keeps the organism from drying out, and it provides some support and structure for movement to occur. In other words, the muscles of the arthropod attach to the exoskeleton, just like the muscles attach to the endoskeleton in the case of all those organisms we mentioned a moment ago, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and so forth. Now we move on at this point to vertebrates. And so in the vertebrate world, what we see is this, that we begin our discussion, at least, with amphibians. And so amphibians are very closely tied to the water, and as we look at the world of vertebrates, we view organisms on a progressing degree of complexity based on their evolutionary history. So life evolved in the water, and so the first organisms were aquatic, and then at some point the organisms evolved to exit the water. And so the more advanced organisms have adaptations that allow them to be independent of the water. The more primitive ones, from an evolutionary perspective, are still very closely tied to the water. And so amphibians are very closely tied to the water as a result of primarily two factors. One is their skin. And so amphibians have very slimy, moist skin, and it has to stay moist because they respire across that skin. In fact, some amphibians don't have lungs at all. Other amphibians, like the frogs, the wood frogs pictured on this slide, have relatively small lungs that are not extremely efficient. Additionally, amphibians reproduce in the water. They have external fertilization, and so these two wood frogs are reproducing. The male's on the back of the female. The female will release the eggs, the male will release the sperm, and that fertilization will occur in a manner similar to fish outside of the organisms. So water is required for that method of reproduction. Within the amphibians, we have several groups. We have frogs and toads, we have salamanders, which look similar to lizards but have slimy, moist skin, and we have the caecilians. Caecilians are a Central and South American organism that are mainly subterranean, but are reminiscent of a snake. They don't have legs, but they are definitely an amphibian. They have that moist, slimy skin. We move on now to reptiles. And so reptiles arose from amphibians, and reptiles have several adaptations that allow them to survive on land that amphibians lack. Reptiles, for instance, have tough, scaly skin that is incapable of respiring across, but prevents the reptiles from losing moisture across it. So they can live out in the desert, in the hot weather, for instance, because there's no danger of them drying out. Reptiles also have internal fertilization. This means that water is not required for their reproduction. Reptiles have amniote eggs. This means that, just like birds, they lay an egg that has this waterproof covering that prevents it from drying out. These are little hognose snakes that are hatching. And so these are the eggs. And so snake eggs are not exactly like bird eggs. They're not quite as hard, but nonetheless, they do have that amniotic membrane, so it prevents water loss. Amphibian eggs must be laid in the water or they'll dry out. They have no amnion, but reptile eggs can be laid on the land. In fact, they must be laid on the land because of that amniotic membrane. Lastly, reptiles have water-conserving kidneys. If you are an amphibian, then you don't exert much energy concentrating your urine. So you're sitting in water, so you drink a good deal of water and you excrete a good deal of very dilute urine. If you're a reptile, then you live in the land, you want to be much more conservative with your water. So you drink a little bit of water and then you concentrate that urine greatly before you excrete it so that you don't have to have a large amount of water and you can live in a relatively dry environment. Within the reptile world, we have several different groups. The crocodilians, which include the alligators, with which you are familiar, the crocodiles, which are found in different parts of the world, including the very southern tip of Florida in the United States, and the caimans. And so caimans are found in several different continents. Different species of caimans are found on different continents throughout the world. Next, we have the turtles. And so we'll talk briefly about the turtles momentarily. This is an alligator snapping turtle that's pictured on this particular slide, a turtle that gets up to close to 200 pounds and lives here in the United States. We have the totoras, which are an interesting lizard-like organism that is found on some islands in the southern hemisphere. We won't return to talk about them again in our discussion, but we have the snakes and lizards, which are very widespread throughout the world, and we will talk a bit about snakes and lizards. So beginning with turtles and tortoises. All turtles have an armor-like shell. That shell can range from anywhere from being just hard as a rock to quite soft and flexible. The turtle we see on the top right-hand side of this slide is a soft shell turtle, probably a spiny soft shell. And if you've ever picked up a spiny soft shell, then you've noticed its soft, flexible shell. Whereas, on the other hand, are, for instance, eastern box turtles that we have in the state have a very hard, inflexible shell. Turtles have horny plates instead of teeth, and so no turtles have teeth, but rather they have this sharp ridge, and they can have very powerful jaw muscles that allow them to shut their mouth very powerfully and break off items of food. Turtles also lay their eggs on land, as do all reptiles, which is not very convenient for turtles in Kentucky because all but one of our turtles, the eastern box turtle, are associated with the water. This means that in order to lay eggs, they must leave the water and build a nest on the land, which can be a dangerous time for them. We make our way now to lizards and snakes. This is the largest order of living reptiles that includes over 95% of the species of living reptiles today. Most lizards, but not all, are insectivores, and most snakes are carnivores. This does vary a little bit. The garter snake that we see depicted in the upper right-hand side of our screen does largely consume insects and small invertebrates, but the snake that we see on the bottom half of the screen has this adaptation referred to as venom. And so you see the venom glands depicted there, and you see the long fangs. And this snake has the ability to bite and inject this toxin into its prey, thereby killing its prey and immobilizing it, of course, so that it can be consumed. We do want to spend just a moment talking about the venomous snakes of Kentucky. So in Kentucky, we have 4 species of venomous snakes. We have copperheads, shown in the upper right-hand corner of our screen, which are found throughout the state of Kentucky. Now, they are quite rare in central Kentucky, but they are found in every county in the state, at least hypothetically. Next, we have timber rattlesnakes. Timber rattlesnakes are found throughout most of the state of Kentucky, but they are not found in northern or central Kentucky. And so we are at Eastern Kentucky University, right on the edge of the range of timber rattlesnakes. If you go to southern Madison County, you can sometimes find a timber rattlesnake, but they're not found in northern Madison County, Fayette, or anywhere up as you head towards Cincinnati. Our next two and final two venomous snakes found in the state are the pygmy rattlesnake, pictured on the upper right-hand side of our screen. The pygmy rattlesnake is quite rare and is found only in a very small area of western Kentucky, in the swampy area out there near the Ohio River. The last snake we have is a water moccasin, and so also known as a cottonmouth, maybe more accurately as a cottonmouth. So cottonmouths are oftentimes the subject of much confusion. Cottonmouths are only found in the far western part of our state. Many people believe that they're found in central and eastern Kentucky, but they're actually not. We do have a snake referred to as a northern water snake, which is somewhat similar to, in appearance, to the water moccasin or cottonmouth, but the northern water snakes are not venomous. So, how can we recognize a venomous snake in Kentucky? Remember, this is only good for Kentucky. If you go to southern Georgia or Florida or Texas, then there are coral snakes there, which are venomous and do not fit the characteristics that we'll talk about. But since we only have 4 species, all these 4 species are in this single group of snakes, and so they share these characteristics that we can use to recognize them. So, the first characteristic that we want to note is this. They have a very large triangular head. So in other words, all our venomous snakes in the state, I'll point with the pointer here, the cursor, have a very large triangular head. There's the base of the triangle, there's the tip of the triangle, and so all of those snakes have this large triangular shaped head. The next characteristics that we want to look at is the eye shape. And so what we see is that all our venomous snakes in the state have this elongated so-called cat eye pupil. So it's this vertical elongated slit. All the non-venomous snakes in the state conveniently have a circular pupil. And so if you see a snake that has this elongated vertical pupil, then you know that it's one of the 4 venomous snakes that we have in the state. Another possibility is simply recognizing the color pattern of the snake. So I have many people that come to me and say that they found a copperhead in their garage or their yard or on campus. And 9 times out of 10, what they're pointing out is a black rat snake or possibly a milk snake or sometimes even a northern water snake. Now, there are copperheads in each county of the state, and sometimes what they see is a copperhead. But many people confuse copperheads with other snakes. But simply Googling a snake color pattern and looking at some examples will be of great help in identifying species of snakes found in the state. Because again, we don't have tremendous snake diversity. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 species of snakes, and only 4 of those, as we pointed out, are venomous. We next make our way to birds. And so birds arose from reptiles and are the only group of organisms that have feathers. So birds also possess a number of adaptations that allow them to fly. Now, some birds, like the emu, depicted in the lower left-hand corner of our screen, cannot fly, but they're the descendants of flighted ancestors. And so their ancestors could fly. They have lost that ability and cannot. Now, a couple of adaptations that birds possess that allow them to fly. One is a highly efficient respiratory system. And so as you would imagine, it takes a great deal of oxygen to provide oxygen to allow those muscles to make enough ATP via aerobic respiration to keep them contracting. And so the bird's respiratory system is extremely well developed to that end. Also, birds have very lightweight bones with air spaces within the bones. And so what we notice is that the bones of birds are not as strong, but they are very lightweight, and therefore that is advantageous in allowing the birds to fly. Lastly, we make our way to mammals. And so what we see is this, that mammals have 5 characteristics that set them apart from the previous groups of organisms that we've talked about. One is hair. No other group of organism possesses hair. So you've noticed baby chicks before in the spring, say at Tractor Supply or Rural King. So those don't actually have hair. That's a type of feathers, as you would imagine, the fuzz that you see on them. Only mammals have hair. only mammals have mammary glands, and so only mammals are producing milk for their offspring. Mammals have distinctive teeth, and so as we look at the bear skull that's depicted on this slide, we can see, for instance, as I point with the pointer, molars, incisors, canines. So we have different types of teeth. Sharks, for instance, have a great number of teeth, but they don't have as many types of teeth. Snakes have lots of teeth, but generally all those teeth are quite similar, with the exception of our venomous snakes, which have distinctive fangs for venom injection. So mammals are unique in their distinctive teeth. Mammals have a highly developed brain, and typically a mammal will be towards the top of what we think of as intelligence. It's also interesting to note that there are even some invertebrates that we consider quite intelligent. Octopi, for instance, have a relatively highly developed brain, extremely highly developed for an invertebrate, but that appears to have evolved independently. And lastly, mammals typically provide extended care for their young. The production of milk really necessitates that, and so oftentimes we see reptiles, amphibians, fish that do not provide any care for their young. Birds and mammals typically provide extended care for their offspring. We have three types of mammals. We have monotremes, which are egg-laying mammals, which are quite strange, marsupials, which are pouched mammals, and eutherians, which are placental mammals. We'll spend a moment talking about these types of mammals now. So we begin with monotremes. Monotremes are mammals, weirdly, that lay eggs. And so we have three species of we have the duck-billed platypus and two species of spiny anteater that fall into this monotreme category. These are very odd organisms and certainly very interesting. When duck-billed platypi were first discovered, they killed one, stuffed it, sent it back to scientists in Europe. And they thought that the scientists that collected it were playing a joke on them. They thought they'd glued a giant duckbill onto a groundhog. They just couldn't believe that it existed. But platypi do fall in this category of mammals that we refer to as monotremes, all of which lay eggs. Marsupials are a larger group of organisms. And so marsupials are found primarily in Australia, but we do have one species, the possum, found in North America. The strategy of a marsupial is to allow the young to be born in a very young, underdeveloped state. And so the baby kangaroos that we see in this person's hand in the lower right-hand side of our screen are examples of that. These baby kangaroos are about the size of a peanut when they're born, so there's no danger or stress in childbirth, at least for the mother, but the kangaroos must make their way to the pouch on the mother and develop inside that pouch. And so it's an interesting reproductive strategy, but one that's widely practiced by this group of mammals, or exclusively practiced by this group of mammals referred to as marsupials. There's our single North American marsupial that's been quite successful, as I think you'll agree, here in North America, and specifically here in central Kentucky. And the last group of organisms, or rather mammals and organisms that we have, are mammals, placental mammals. These are the most diverse mammals. In other words, most mammals are placental mammals. These are mammals in which the young develop in the mother's uterus. The placenta is a structure that consists of a series of tubes, essentially, that connect the mother and the fetus. Now, the tubes don't lead to an exchange of blood between the mother and the fetus, but rather they intertwine with one another and provide a great deal of surface area so that there can be the transfer of nutrients and oxygen and waste back and forth from the mother and the fetus until the time that the fetus will be born. So, as we mentioned, these are by far the most common group of mammals. Now, this does finish our lecture on Chapter 19. What you'll notice is this is a rare case in which we didn't follow the chapter exactly in a one-to-one fashion, but rather there are parts of the chapter that we didn't cover in this lecture. Those parts of the chapter are not included on the review sheet, and they won't be included on the exam. So remember, for Chapter 19, you're responsible just for the topics that we covered in this lecture. Those are the same topics that appear on the review sheet.